She did not belong here. Every chandelier in Carlisle House knew it. Every silk-gowned lady turning slowly on the arm of her escort knew it. The footmen standing rigid at their posts knew it. And Mira Voss, 20 years old, daughter of a Devonshire rope-maker, dressed in a gown that had survived 3 winters and was beginning to show the evidence of each one, knew it most of all. She had come only because Lady Fentworth had commanded it. "Fetch the fan I left in the red salon, girl, quickly, before the second waltz." A servant's errand, that was all. She was meant to slip in through the servants' corridor, retrieve what was forgotten, and dissolve back into the invisible architecture of the evening. She had not been meant to lose her way. She had not been meant to step through the wrong door and find herself standing at the edge of the grand ballroom, 200 pairs of eyes catching the flicker of the chandeliers, the murmur of exquisite conversation rolling through the air like warm tide. And she had most certainly not been meant to lock eyes with him. He stood at the far end of the room, Caspian Aldermore, Duke of Fenwick, 34 years old, master of 4 estates, and possessor of a gaze so cold and so precise it had reportedly ended parliamentary careers and reduced grown men to careful silence. He was looking directly at her, not through her, the way the rest of them did, at her. The laughter began a breath later, sharp, glittering, vicious. But the Duke did not look away. "Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. Knowing you are there, in your city, your quiet room, your corner of the earth, makes this feel like something more than a story. It makes it feel like a secret shared between us. Tonight we go to London, spring of 1868. The season is at its most merciless height. The ballrooms of Mayfair blaze each evening like lit ships on a dark sea, carrying their cargo of ambition, beauty, and carefully managed desperation. Fortunes are made and lost between one dance and the next. Reputations, built across generations, can be unmade in a single whispered sentence passed between the wrong pair of lips. It is a world with a precise and pitiless order. Everyone within it understands their place, the dukes at the summit, the servants at the foundation, and between them an invisible architecture of rules so deeply embedded they are no longer even spoken, only enforced, swiftly and without mercy, when anyone dares forget them. Mira Voss had never forgotten her place. She was too practical for that, too clear-eyed about the distance between her world and theirs. But Caspian Aldermore, Duke of Fenwick, a man who had inherited not only a title, but the particular loneliness that arrives with absolute power, had spent years looking out across rooms full of acceptable women and feeling something he could not name, the steady, quiet certainty that everything he was supposed to want was precisely what he did not. He would not have a name for what he felt the moment he saw her standing in the doorway, wide-eyed, flushed, wearing a mended gown that the room found hilarious. He would only know that he could not look away, and that would be the beginning of everything. Mira Voss had a talent for silence. It was the most useful thing a lady's maid could possess, the ability to move through grand houses like water through a crack, present without being noticed, necessary without being acknowledged. In 14 months of service to Lady Fentworth, she had perfected it. Tonight, she had lost it entirely. The ballroom of Carlisle House sprawled before her like something from a fever dream, all gold leaf and candlelight and the slow, expensive rotation of London's finest. She had pushed open what she believed was the door to the red salon. She had been catastrophically wrong. For 3 full seconds, no one noticed her. Then a woman near the entrance, pearl-roped, pomaded, magnificent in her disdain, turned, looked, and laughed, the sound like a dropped tray. Good heavens! Did someone's laundry wander in? The ripple moved fast. Mira felt it cross the room before she could draw breath. The tilted heads, the raised fans, the particular cruelty of 200 people finding the same thing amusing at the same instant. Her gown was clean. She had pressed it herself that very morning, but it was 3 seasons old, and the hem told the truth of it. And in this room, truth without gilding was simply embarrassment. She should have retreated. Every practical instinct she owned told her to step back through that door and disappear. She did not retreat. She stood, shoulders straight, chin level, and allowed them their moment. Because it would pass. These things always passed. It was only when she felt the quality of the room change, a subtle dropping away of laughter from one particular direction, that she looked toward the far end of the boardroom. The Duke of Fenwick was watching her, not with mockery, with something she could not immediately name. Caspian Aldermore had attended 11 consecutive seasons of London's social calendar with the disciplined endurance of a man serving a sentence he had imposed upon himself. He attended because his late mother had asked it of him. He stayed because leaving early provoked gossip, and gossip, poorly managed, became ammunition. He spoke when required. He danced when cornered. He observed, always, everything. He was observing now. The young woman standing in the doorway had not crumbled. That was the first thing he noted. The laughter had rolled toward her like a wave intending damage, and she had simply absorbed it, feet planted, jaw set, eyes steady and dark as river water in winter. She was not performing composure. She possessed it. There was a difference, and Caspian, who had watched performers of composure his entire adult life, recognized the distinction instantly. He had no business crossing the room. He crossed it anyway. The crowd parted for him, as crowds always did, with a kind of instinctive deference that he had long since stopped registering. He moved through the laughter and the staring and the whispered speculations and arrived before her before he had made any conscious decision to do so. Up close, she was younger than he had first supposed, perhaps 20, perhaps slightly more. She had ink on the inside of her left wrist, faint, nearly scrubbed away, but present. A writer, then, or a reader. The gown was mended at the right cuff, with stitching that did not quite match, executed, he could tell, by her own hand. She met his gaze without flinching. Most members of Parliament did not manage that. "You appear to have lost your way," he said quietly. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied. Her voice was clear and unhurried. "Though I am beginning to suspect the house itself is at fault." Behind him, the silence deepened into something new. By morning, Carlisle House knew everything. This was the nature of large households. They ran on information the way engines ran on coal, and the exchange of it moved faster below stairs than above. By the time Mira arrived in the servants' hall at 6:30, the account of the previous evening had already been assembled, embellished, and distributed. The Duke spoke to the maid. The Duke spoke to Lady Fentworth's maid. He crossed the whole room. He bowed. Did you hear it? He bowed. Mira poured her tea and said nothing. She had been replaying the moment since she'd closed her eyes the night before, not with the giddiness that Mrs. Tufton, the housekeeper, seemed to expect. She kept glancing over with an expression of barely contained delight, but with a more careful, unsettled attention. He had bowed, minimally, correctly, without theatre, and then Lady Fentworth had appeared at Mira's elbow like a weather event, taken her firmly by the arm, and propelled her back through the correct door with a grip that would leave a mark. No further words had been exchanged, and yet... The gown is adequate, Mira told herself, examining the cuff she had restitched at 2 in the morning. The stitching holds. You have your position and your wages and your sense, which is more than can be said for anyone who spends their evenings manufacturing significance from a 10-second exchange with a duke. She was sensible. She had been sensible her entire life. It was simply that no one had ever crossed a room full of laughing people to stand beside her before. She noticed the footstep behind her a half-second too late. Miss Voss. She turned. The Duke of Fenwick stood in the servants' hall doorway, tall, perfectly dressed, and clearly aware that his presence here was extraordinary enough that every person in the room had gone absolutely rigid. "I have a matter to discuss with Lady Fentworth," he said, his eyes on Mira alone. "I wondered if you might announce me." It was not why he had come. They both knew it. Lady Fentworth received the Duke in the blue sitting-room and spent 45 minutes being charming about matters Mira was not permitted to hear. Mira stood in the corridor outside, as was correct, available should her mistress require anything, and stared at the wallpaper pattern, a repeating spray of pale roses with intense concentration. She was not thinking about the Duke. She was thinking about the fact that when he had handed her his pard to carry upstairs to Lady Fentworth, their fingers had not touched. She had been careful, he had been careful, and yet she had been aware of the precise inch of air between them with a vividness that was frankly inconvenient. The door opened. "Mira." Lady Fentworth's voice carried the particular tone it acquired when she was calculating. "His Grace requires someone familiar with the Fentworth Library catalogue. Apparently Lord Fentworth and he share an interest in a particular set of maps, and there is some question of provenance." Mira blinked. "You wish me to—" "You catalogued the library last autumn. You know it better than anyone in the house." Lady Fentworth smiled with the warmth of someone arranging furniture. "His Grace has asked if you might be lent to Fenwick House for the purpose. One afternoon. Perfectly proper. Mrs. Aldous from his household will be present throughout." Mira understood, with absolute clarity, 3 things simultaneously. First, this was not about maps. Second, Lady Fentworth had agreed, which meant she considered the Duke's interest, in whatever form it took, an asset rather than a danger. Third, Mira herself had not been consulted, because ladies' maids were lent like books, not asked like people. She ought to refuse. She had no mechanism by which to refuse. "Of course, my lady," she said. From inside the room the Duke said nothing, but she heard him exhale, slowly, deliberately, like a man who had been holding his breath. Fenwick House did not intimidate her. Mira decided this firmly as the carriage deposited her at its entrance. 4 stories of pale Portland stone, columns like standing soldiers, windows that reflected the grey March sky in long, expressionless plains. She had grown up in a village where the largest building was the mill. She had worked in 3 grand houses before Lady Fentworth's. She understood that impressive architecture was simply the material expression of accumulated money, and money, however much of it existed, did not change the nature of rooms. Rooms were rooms. The library was extraordinary. It occupied the entirety of the East Wing's ground floor, ceiling vaulted and gallery railed, books shelved in dark mahogany cases that ran from floor to the upper gallery with the density of a cathedral stonework. The smell of it, old paper and linseed oil and something faintly resinous, reached her before she crossed the threshold, and she stopped, involuntarily, and simply breathed it in. It has that effect on most people. She turned. The Duke stood by the window, coat exchanged for a simpler jacket, cravat notably absent. He looked, without the full armor of formal dress, less like a monument and more like a man. Still formidable, but carrying the formidability differently, like it cost him something he had grown accustomed to paying. "The maps are in the 3rd case on the left," he continued, "though I suspect you've already guessed this is not about maps. Mira set down the notebook she'd brought. "I had formed that impression, Your Grace. I wanted to apologize," he said, "for last evening. You were laughed at in a room full of people who had no right to your attention, and I walked across and made it worse by marking you out further." She had not expected that. She studied him for a moment, this careful, guarded man, and found the apology was genuine. "You also," she said slowly, "made it stop." Something in the room rearranged itself quietly, like a tide turning. They spent 3 hours with the maps. This surprised Caspian. He had anticipated perhaps one, sufficient to establish the fiction of a purpose and allow them some neutral, supervised conversation in which he might, he was not certain what he had intended, reassure himself, perhaps, that she was ordinary upon closer examination, that the quality he had seen in her from across the ballroom was a trick of candlelight and his own long-standing boredom with the familiar. She was not ordinary. She moved through the library with the unself-conscious authority of someone entirely at home in the presence of books, pulling volumes without hesitation, cross-referencing with a speed that spoke of genuine practice, asking questions about the map's acquisition history that no one, in Caspian's memory, had ever thought to ask. She had opinions, she expressed them precisely and without performance, and when he disagreed, she did not retract. She listened to his reasoning, weighed it, and told him whether it had altered her view. It usually had not. Mrs. Aldous, his housekeeper, sat knitting in the corner with the discreet attention of a woman who was paid to be unobtrusive and was very good at it. "Your father was a rope-maker," Caspian said, during a pause when Mira was copying a notation into her notebook. "Yes." She did not look up. "He read every book the lending library possessed, twice over, and considered it the great injustice of his life that he'd been born into hands instead of a study." "And you?" She looked up then, and the late afternoon light found her fully for a moment. "I consider it the great good fortune of mine," she said, "that I inherited both." He did not say what he was thinking. He was thinking it very loudly. April arrived with the social calendar's customary brutality. For Caspian, it meant a succession of dinners, assemblies, and morning calls, in which eligible women were produced before him with the regularity of courses at a formal meal. Each one accomplished, pleasant, and leaving him with the same hollow, courteous indifference as the last. Lady Dorinda Hext, Miss Octavia Fremlin, the Honourable Prudence Starfall, who was considered exceptionally suitable by everyone who mentioned her name, which was frequently. They were all of them perfectly fine. He was perfectly terrible to them, not unkind, never unkind, but absent in some fundamental way that their mothers sensed and found alarming. He had been to Fenwick House Library twice more, on invented pretexts that neither he nor Mira acknowledged as invented. The second time, she had arrived with a question of her own, whether he had a particular edition of Humboldt's travel writings, and he had spent an hour locating it, which was the most purposeful he had felt in months. He was not naive about what was occurring. He was, in fact, almost aggressively clear-eyed about it. He was a duke, she was a lady's maid. The distance between those two facts was not merely social, it was structural, load-bearing, the kind that could not be wished away by a man who understood what his title actually required of him, which made it worse, not better. Because when he was in that library with Mira Voss, discussing cartography, or her father's reading habits, or the particular injustice of how lending libraries advocated their stock, he was not performing. He was simply present, in a way he could not recall being since before his father died and left him the estate and the weight that came with it. He told none of this to anyone. He began, however, to think about it constantly. Mira knew she was in difficulty when she began rising earlier than necessary. She was a practical woman. Her mother had raised her to be so. Her years in service had reinforced it. Practicality meant understanding your position with clear eyes and refusing the indulgences that led women in her circumstances to ruin. Romanticism was a luxury for women with options. She had catalogued her options honestly and found them modest but real. She was skilled, well regarded, sufficiently educated. She could continue in service, save her wages, perhaps one day open a small lending concern or a milliner's shop. She had written the arithmetic of this future in her notebook on 3 separate occasions as a reminder. She had not written about the Duke. She did not permit herself that. What she permitted was the hours in the library, which she justified as professionally enriching and entirely proper. Mrs. Aldous was always present. The conversation never strayed, not explicitly. It was simply that every exchange felt strangely essential, the way water is essential, taken for granted until its absence. The difficulty arrived in the form of Mr. Gellard. He was under footman to Lord Carew, 30 years old, respectable and sturdy and openly interested. He had asked twice in the past fortnight if he might call on her. He was everything sensible. He was the arithmetic she had written in her notebook. She could not make herself say yes. She sat with that knowledge for a long evening and examined it without mercy. She was not in love with the Duke, she was not such a fool as that, but she had been in his company enough times now that Gellard's particular brand of pleasant ordinariness felt, by comparison, like a room with no windows. She did not say yes to Gellard. She did not say no either. She said she required more time. She suspected she was only postponing the inevitable clarity that would arrive when the Duke inevitably did what dukes did, selected an appropriate wife, and ceased to need the company of maps and borrowed books. She prepared herself for it. She did not feel prepared. London noticed everything. By May it had noticed Caspian Aldermore. Not in the usual manner, his attendance at assemblies was faithfully monitored, his dancing partners catalogued, his expressions of mild boredom documented as they arose, but in a newer, more pointed way. He had declined 3 introductions in a fortnight. He had left the Ruffmore dinner 40 minutes early with an excuse that Lady Ruffmore repeated to 6 women, each of whom repeated it to 5 more. He had been seen twice entering in a dress in Marybone that was identified after some inquiry as Lady Fentworth's town-house. Lady Fentworth herself had said nothing publicly, but she was the kind of woman who collected advantageous information the way others collected porcelain, and she had begun looking at Mira with an expression that was equal parts calculation and warning. "You understand your position here," she said one morning, not unkindly, while Mira arranged her hair. "You are a good girl, Mira, sensible. I have always valued that." "Yes, my lady." "Sensible girls," Lady Fentworth continued, "understand that certain attentions, however flattering, resolve themselves in only one of 2 ways. Either a man of his rank collects himself and does his duty to his name, or," she paused, "he does not, and the woman who has permitted herself to believe otherwise finds the second outcome considerably more damaging to herself than to him." Mira met her employer's eyes in the mirror. "I am aware of the mathematics, my lady," she said quietly. "Good." Lady Fentworth's expression settled into something almost gentle. "Then be aware also that I intend to dismiss you with an excellent reference should it become necessary to protect both your reputation and my own. I tell you this now rather than later because you deserve the warning." Mira returned to her work. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her mind was not. The invitation arrived at Fenwick House addressed to Lady Fentworth, as all invitations did, but with a note attached in the Duke's handwriting, brief, correct, requesting that Miss Voss be permitted to accompany her mistress to the Aldermore Foundation's public lecture on cartographic history at the Royal Institution. Lady Fentworth read it twice, showed it to no one, and told Mira, in a tone of careful neutrality, that her attendance was required. The lecture hall held perhaps 200. Mira sat in the row behind her mistress, in her customary position of careful invisibility, and was not invisible at all, because the Duke, seated on the dais with 2 fellows of the institution, looked directly at her the moment she entered, and did not pretend otherwise. He spoke for 40 minutes about the history of surveying, the epistemology of map-making, the way a cartographer's assumptions shaped the borders they drew. He was a different creature at a lectern than he was anywhere else. The guardedness fell away, replaced by something undefended, almost ardent, the manner of a man discussing the thing he actually cared about. Mira found she could not look away. Afterwards, in the entrance hall, he found her in the crowd, or she found him, she was not entirely sure which, and they stood at the edge of a pillar with 3 feet of propriety between them, while the noise of 200 people provided the necessary cover for conversation. "You were thinking about the Humboldt," he said quietly. She had been. He had mentioned the same explorer in the 3rd chapter, and she had seen in his face the exact passage he was referencing. "You were thinking," she replied, "that you have never once been able to say what you actually mean in a room with more than 4 people." The silence that followed was long. "No," he agreed, very softly, "I have not." They stood another moment. "Caspian," he said. His name, his given name, dropped into the space between them like a stone into still water. She felt the weight of it settle. "Mira," she replied. It was only names. It was the least proper thing that had ever been said between them. He came to Lady Fentworth on the 1st of June. Mira did not know he was coming. She was in the garden, reading, taking the thin early summer warmth on her face with the careful pleasure of a woman who had learned not to expect abundance. She heard the carriage, did not think to look. She heard Lady Fentworth's voice raised, briefly, in something that was not quite anger, surprise perhaps, or the particular affront of being presented with something outside one's calculations. Then quiet. Then Mrs. Tufton appearing at the garden door with an expression of absolute, barely contained astonishment. "Miss Voss, her ladyship wishes to see you in the blue sitting-room immediately." Mira folded her page and went. Lady Fentworth stood at the mantelpiece. The Duke stood by the window, the same window where Mira had once spent 45 minutes staring at a wallpaper of pale roses. "His Grace," Lady Fentworth said, in a voice so controlled it was its own warning, "has made a request that I am required to pass to you, as it concerns you entirely." Caspian turned. He was nervous. She had never seen him nervous. It looked on him like spillness taken past its natural point, a rope pulled slightly too taut. "I am not able to offer you what you deserve," he began, and she felt the sentence like cold water. "I am aware of that. I am aware that what I am about to say is either the most honest thing I have said in years or the greatest imposition I have ever visited upon another person, and I am not certain which." He crossed the room, stopped at a correct distance. His eyes were winter iron and completely open. "I do not want to marry for convenience or legacy or because the season requires it. I have not, in 12 years as Duke, wanted anything for myself. I want—" He stopped. "I want to know if there is any version of a future you might be willing to consider in which I am in it." Mira said nothing for a long moment. "That," she said finally, "is not a proposal." "No," he agreed. "It is a question. Because you are not a woman one proposes to without first establishing whether she would entertain one. I know enough of you to know that much." Behind them, Lady Fentworth's composure appeared to be requiring significant maintenance. Mira looked at him, this careful, guarded, earnest man who had crossed rooms and libraries and every structural expectation of his world to stand in front of her and ask, not demand. "Ask properly," she said quietly, "and I will give you a proper answer." He asked properly. Not that evening. Lady Fentworth at that point had reached the limits of what even her considerable nerve could witness, and had suggested, in a tone that brooked nothing, that his Grace might wish to conclude his visit and return when arrangements had been made more formally. Caspian had returned 3 days later, with his solicitor, which was correct, with a letter for Lady Fentworth outlining his intentions, which was appropriate, and with, under his arm and slightly self-consciously, the Humboldt he had promised her 4 months ago and never quite found the right moment to produce. The conversation with Lady Fentworth took 20 minutes. The conversation with Mira took considerably longer. They sat in the blue sitting-room, Mrs. Aldous present again, faithful as punctuation, and he told her the truth of his life, the weight of the dukedom accepted at 22, the decade of performing the role while the person underneath it grew quieter and quieter, the genuine conviction that he was unsuited for marriage until he had walked across a ballroom toward a woman who refused to collapse under the weight of a room's ridicule. She told him the truth of hers, the mill, her father's books, 3 years of saving wages, the notebook with its arithmetic, Mr. Gellard and his pleasant ordinariness. He winced, barely perceptibly, at the mention of Gellard. She noticed. She did not address it, but something in her settled, with a warmth she had no longer bothered denying. "You understand," she said carefully, "that this will be discussed, permanently. I will always have been a maid. The ton does not forget." "I know." "You will be mocked." "I have been feared for 12 years," he said. "I find I prefer the alternative." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had crossed rooms and cancelled dinners and spent hours in a library pretending to need maps, who apologized when he had done nothing wrong and asked questions before he asked anything else. "Yes," she said. It was a small word. It landed between them like the first of something very large. They were married in September at the private chapel on the Fenwick estate in Devonshire. The Ton discussed it vigorously for 2 months, and then, as the Ton does when deprived of fresh outrage, found other subjects. Some of the initial commentary was unkind. A satirical pamphlet appeared briefly. Lady Fentworth, who had attended the wedding in a magnificent aubergine gown and wept in a manner she later attributed to the autumn chill, sent it to Caspian, framed as a wedding gift, with a card that read, "12 months hence this will seem very small." She was correct. Mira spent her first winter as Duchess of Fenwick reorganizing the library, properly this time, to a system she designed herself, and beginning correspondence with 3 lending libraries in Devonshire about expanding their holdings of scientific texts for families who could not afford their own. Caspian read every letter she drafted and offered no edits, only the occasional marginal note, "Brilliant. Send it." He lectured at the Royal Institution twice more. She attended both times and sat in the front row, and the quality of attention she gave his work was, several of the senior fellows noted later, considerably more rigorous than their own. There were difficulties, as there are always difficulties. There were dinners at which she was watched. There were women who were unkind with their manners, if not their words. There were moments when she felt the full distance between the life she had come from and the rooms she now occupied, and held both realities at once with the same steady practicality with which she had always held hard things. And there were evenings, many evenings, when they sat together in that extraordinary library, he reading, she writing, the fire doing its patient work in the grate, and the silence between them was the kind that has no discomfort in it, only the accumulated weight of having chosen, plainly and deliberately, to be exactly where you are. She had not expected to find a life as large as this. He had not expected to feel, this late, as though his had only just begun. They did not say so most evenings. They did not need to.